All right, strap yourselves in because today,
You're going supersonic.
exactly, we're diving deep into the F-104D Starfighter.
The missile with a man in it.
No kidding.
Yeah.
We've got a 1960 flight manual declassified and everything.
A real treasure trove.
And this deep dive, it's not just about the Starfighter's specs.
Oh.
We're talking about actually flying this thing.
What those pilots had to know, how they handled it.
Right. What were the challenges back then?
Well, the manual itself.
It's like a time capsule, you know?
Straight from the early days of supersonic flight.
And the way it's written, direct.
Dirt.
It assumes you know how to fly.
Already.
This is all about operating the F-104D.
Safely, effectively.
Precisely.
And that positive approach, they emphasize.
Oh, yeah.
They tell you what you can do.
But there's this underlying message.
Don't even think about anything else.
Exactly. It's almost like they're saying, this plane is not messing around.
And those safety of flight supplements, constantly updating the manual, shows you how much they were still learning about this aircraft.
I can picture those pilots
Getting new updates all the time.
thinking, what new quirk do I need to watch out for today?
Definitely a steep learning curve. Now, about the manual structure,
Be methodical.
description, normal procedures, emergencies.
Clear, organized,
Easy to
nav.
life or death, you know.
Absolutely. But there's one section that really caught my eye.
Which one?
Section 6, Flight Characteristics.
Interesting. What about it?
It required a separate supplement. Confidential.
Confidential. What could be so sensitive about how this plane flies?
It makes you wonder, right?
Maybe something about its challenging handling.
Could be. Maneuvers that were just too risky to put in the standard manual.
Oh, exciting.
So shall we step into the cockpit?
Let's do it. I'm looking at these images from the manual.
What grabs your attention first?
That throttle quadrant?
Yeah.
The layout is wild.
Not your typical setup at all.
And the afterburner control, it's totally separate from the main product. They really wanted to highlight that raw power.
It's intimidating just looking at it.
And the sheer number of warning lights and gauges.
It's overwhelming.
The complexity of this aircraft.
The pilots had to process so much information.
They were like human computers.
Speaking of power, that J79 GE7 engine.
A true beast.
State-of-the-art back then.
Oh, absolutely. One of the first axial flow turbojets with an afterburner.
Giving the F-104D that insane thrust.
And the afterburner system itself, quite complex.
I was reading about the multi-stage fuel flow.
Controlled by the throttle position.
So different throttle positions.
It's different levels of afterburner engagement.
Wow, imagine managing that.
Requiring real finesse.
And all those fuel lines, pumps, valves, controls.
A whole network just to keep that engine fed.
It's mind-boggling.
Essential for that J79 engine.
The heart of the F-104.
Absolutely. Quick reaction times were crucial.
Those Soviet bombers weren't going to wait around.
Not a second to spare.
Every component played a role.
Vital to its mission as a supersonic interceptor.
But all that power came at a price, right?
It did.
The F-104 was notorious for its handling.
Especially at low speeds.
How did they tame it?
Well, they had a stability augmentation system.
3-axis automatically corrects for small changes.
Basically an early form of fly-by-wire.
Cutting edge for the 1960s.
Very advanced for its time.
Still sounds like a handful to fly.
It demanded a lot from its pilots.
Precision, skill.
Absolute.
And then there's getting it back on the ground.
Oh, yes, the landing.
That boundary layer control system.
A unique feature.
Designed to help it land at slower speeds.
It used bleed air from the engine.
To smooth airflow over the wings?
Exactly.
Clever, but risky relying on the engine during landing.
It added another layer of complexity.
Pilots had to be on top of it.
Always thinking ahead.
It seems like every feature on this plane had a trade-off.
High performance, but demanding.
Advanced tech, but potential for failure.
A constant balancing act.
And then there's the ejection seat.
Ah, yes, the infamous downward ejection system.
Not something you see every day.
A necessity because of that detailed design.
I can see why, but it doesn't sound very comfortable.
Especially at low altitudes.
The manual is very specific about safe ejection altitudes.
Pilots had to make quick decisions based on that information.
It adds a whole other layer of danger.
The ejection sequence itself is quite a process.
A lot happening in those few
A
seconds.
series of automatic releases, parachute deployment.
They're really ahead of everything.
It's a complex system designed for survival.
It makes you appreciate what those pilots went through.
Absolutely. They were operating at the edge of what was possible.
Facing incredible risks.
True pioneers of their time.
It makes you wonder, what was it really like to fly this thing?
A question we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive. You know, amidst all these technical details,
It's easy to forget.
the historical context,
Right.
the Cold War,
The F-104D, It was a product of its time.
Absolutely. A time of intense rivalry, the threat of nuclear war always looming. They were operating under incredible pressure.
Front lines of the Cold War.
Their mission was vital.
We've talked about the challenging handling, the complex systems.
But those pilots, they were dealing with so much more than just the technical aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So getting back to those systems.
And ones that made planes such a challenge.
We mentioned the stability augmentation system, that early fly-by-wire.
Right.
But there's another component that caught my eye.
Which one?
The yaw damper.
Ah, yes.
What does it actually do?
Well, imagine the F-104D is like a dart.
Right.
The yaw damper keeps it from wobbling.
Keeps it stable.
Especially at high speeds.
So no fishtailing.
Exactly. The nose pointed straight ahead.
Essential for accuracy.
Especially when you're trying to intercept a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour.
Right. Those bombers weren't exactly standing still.
Not at all. Every second counted.
So this yaw damper.
It's all about maintaining stability in those high-speed situations.
Makes sense. It was a constant battle against those aerodynamic forces.
A constant push and pull.
Speaking of aerodynamic forces, let's go back to that boundary layer control system.
Okay.
We talked about how it helped with landing at slower speeds.
Right. Reducing that stall speed.
But I'm still curious about how it actually works.
It's actually quite ingenious.
Tell me more.
Think of that thin layer of air clinging to the wings.
The boundary layer.
Exactly. And at low speeds, it can create drag.
I see.
So the boundary layer control system
What does it do?
energizes that layer of air
How?
by blowing high-pressure air from the engine over the wings.
Wow, so it's like giving the wings an extra boost of lift.
You could say that.
But we discussed the risks of relying on bleed air from the engine,
Right.
especially during landing.
When the engine is already at low power.
What happens if the engine fails during that critical moment?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is.
If you lose engine power, you lose boundary layer control.
So you're dealing with a dead engine A&D, no extra help for landing.
A double whammy.
Talk about a test of skill and nerve.
Definitely not a situation you want to find yourself in.
It seems like those pilots were constantly juggling risks and trade-offs.
Performance versus controllability.
Advanced technology versus potential failure points.
This is tightrope walk.
And the manual, it addresses so many of those potential issues.
It has
All those emergency procedures.
offering a wide range of scenarios.
Engine failure, hydraulic system problems.
And one that always makes me think,
What's that?
a runaway afterburner.
Oh, that sounds terrifying.
It is a serious situation.
What exactly happens?
The afterburner gets stuck in the on position.
So it's just blasting fuel into the engine,
Essentially, yes.
leading to rapid fuel consumption, overheating.
Potentially catastrophic engine damage.
Yikes. That's like having your car stuck with the accelerator pedal jammed down.
A pretty good analogy.
So what do you do if you're faced with a runaway afterburner in an F-104D?
Well, the manual outlines a procedure.
I'm all ears.
And it might seem counterintuitive at first.
Go.
Instead of immediately cutting off the fuel flow,
What?
you actually increase the throttle to its maximum position.
Wait, really? That seems like the opposite of what you'd want to do.
I know. It sounds strange.
Why wouldn't you just shut down the engine right away?
The idea is to try and regain control of the afterburner.
I see.
But by moving the throttle to a position where it's mechanically limited.
So you're forcing it to stop.
In a way, yes.
Clever.
If that doesn't work, then you have to resort to shutting down the engine.
But that's a last resort, especially at low altitude.
Exactly.
They were really trying everything to keep that engine running,
Every second counted.
especially in combat.
Remember, the F-104D was designed for quick reaction times.
A dead engine could mean mission failure.
Or worse.
So we've talked about engine failures, stability issues,
And of course,
the downward ejection
the
seat.
elephant in the room.
It's a design feature that sparked a lot of debate.
Understandably so.
It was necessary because of that T-tail design.
A conventional upward ejection would have been too risky.
Right, the pilot could have hit the tail.
Exactly.
But downward ejection, it comes with its own challenges.
Especially at low altitudes.
Less time to clear the aircraft.
And for the parachute to fully deploy.
The manuals are very clear about those minimum safe ejection altitudes.
Pilots had to make split-second decisions based on their situation.
Another layer of risk.
Inherent in flying these high-performance aircraft.
And that ejection sequence, as we touched upon earlier,
Quite complex.
a lot happening in those crucial seconds.
A marvel of engineering, really.
Designed to maximize the pilot's chances of survival.
Absolutely. A carefully choreographed sequence.
Automatic releases, parachute deployment.
Even a system to cut the oxygen hose and communication leads.
Wow, they really did think of everything.
It highlights the level of detail and planning.
That went into every aspect of the F-104D's operation.
They were prepared for the worst-case scenario.
It makes you wonder, how often did those pilots actually have to use these procedures?
It's a good question.
It reminds us of,
That we're only seeing a part of the story.
through this manual,
There's a whole human element behind these procedures.
stories of skill, courage, maybe even tragedy.
We can only imagine.
It really makes you appreciate the dedication of those pilots.
They faced danger head-on.
Made life or death decisions under incredible pressure.
True professionals.
This deep dive, it's not just about the machine.
It's about the people who flew it.
The human element is just as important.
Absolutely. And there's still more to uncover.
More fascinating details in this manual.
Waiting to be explored.
As we go deeper into this F-104D flight manual.
This is amazing.
How every detail tells a story.
About those early days of supersonic flight.
The challenges, the triumphs,
It's like a window into a whole different world of aviation.
and the manual.
It doesn't hold back.
It's full of practical information, the stuff pilots really needed to know.
To operate this aircraft safely and effectively,
Like there's a whole section on weight and balance calculations.
critical for any aircraft, but especially for a high-performance jet like the F-104D.
They were so specific about how to load fuel and equipment.
It wasn't just a matter of throwing things in and hoping for the best.
No kidding. They even talk about tip tank flutter. It
Yeah.
sounds kind of scary.
Could be.
What exactly is it?
Well, imagine those external fuel tanks mounted on the wingtips.
Okay, I'm picturing them.
Now, picture them vibrating uncontrollably at high
Oh,
speed.
I see where this is going.
That's tip tank flutter.
And it's bad because
It can cause serious damage.
the tanks could even break off.
In extreme cases, yes.
Not something you want at Mach 2.
Definitely not.
So how did they deal with this tip tank flutter?
The solution is surprisingly simple.
What is it?
Adjust your airspeed.
Really? That's it.
By carefully controlling their speed
They could change the airflow,
over the wings and those external tanks.
reducing the flutter.
Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it?
Between pushing the limits and staying within safe margins.
Like walking a tightrope. Precisely.
Speaking of tight spaces,
I know what you're going to say.
those ground clearances.
That long nose, those tip tanks.
It must have been tricky maneuvering this thing on the ground,
Pilots had to be extra careful when taxiing.
especially in tight spaces.
The manual has diagrams showing minimum turning radii, clearance distances,
They really had to know their aircraft's dimensions.
and be aware of their surroundings.
Even on the ground, operating this aircraft required precision.
Attention to detail was crucial.
They even had a chart highlighting danger areas around the aircraft,
Places you definitely didn't want to be standing.
especially when those afterburners lit up.
The exhaust from that J79 engine could be incredibly dangerous,
Those charts were essential for the ground crews.
defining safe zones, preventing accidents,
A reminder of the raw power these aircraft possessed.
even when they were stationary.
Well, I think we're ready to get back in the air. Let's fly. But before we do...
What's that? There's one more section I want to look at.
Which one?
The forced landing procedures.
Yes.
They're incredibly detailed.
Step-by-step instructions, diagrams showing the ideal approach.
Forced landings are never a good thing,
But they're a reality of aviation.
especially with an aircraft like the F-104D.
With its high landing speed, those tricky handling characteristics,
It must have taken a lot of skill and composure to execute a forced landing safely.
those pilots had to be at the top of their game,
The manual was their guide,
leading them through each step.
considering airspeed, altitude, wind conditions,
Even the optimal way to touch down,
maximizing their chances of a successful outcome.
despite the difficult circumstances.
And the tone of the manual, it's so matter-of-fact.
It's almost chilling.
If you have to land with the gear up, here's what you do.
If the engine flames out on takeoff, here are your options.
No sugarcoating.
It reflects the mindset of military pilots back then.
Focused, prepared.
Trained to handle emergencies as a matter of routine.
After reading this manual,
I bet you have a whole new level of respect for those pilots.
I really do.
They were operating at the cutting edge,
Pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
with full awareness of the risks.
So, what's the big takeaway from this deep dive into the F-104D flight manual?
It's more than just a technical document.
It's a story, isn't it?
A story of a pivotal moment in aviation history.
A time of incredible innovation, fierce competition.
And it reminds us
That even with all the advancements in technology,
human skill and judgment.
they're still essential.
Absolutely. Those pilots, they were more than just test pilots or fighter jocks,
They were pioneers.
pushing the limits of what was humanly possible.
And this manual,
It gives us a peek into their world.
their struggles, their victories,
It makes you think, knowing what we know now about the F-104D.
its power, its demands, the risks.
Would you have wanted to fly it?
That's a question for every listener to ponder.
A question to consider.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of the F-104D Starfighter.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring.
And keep asking questions.
We'll see you on our next deep dive.